All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really complex and fascinating topic, and that's the rise of militarism in Japan.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that has lots of layers.
You've given us some really interesting sources to work with for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Everything from sort of general world history texts to like some pretty intense primary source documents.
Yeah, you've got a good mix.
So it's like trying to piece together a puzzle here. And I guess our mission for this deep dive is to figure out like what were the key factors?
Yeah, what were the ingredients that kind of led Japan down this particular path?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
To become, increasingly militaristic.
absolutely.
So I guess just to get us started, to understand the rise of militarism in Japan, we kind of have to take a step back and look at the broader context of like what was going on in Japan in like the late 1800s.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, right? Because you can't just look at like a snapshot in time. You have to understand what led up to that moment. And in the late 19th century, Japan was going through this really dramatic transformation.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot in these world history materials about the Meiji Restoration. So
Exactly.
at the end of the Edo period and then like 1868.
Huge turning point.
This is like a massive shift.
Yeah, they went from being like a feudal society to a modern industrialized nation in like the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it's like whiplash.
Yeah, and they were very much inspired by Western models.
Yeah, so they're looking at what's going on in Europe and the US and saying, hey, we need to kind of catch up.
Exactly. They saw that they needed to modernize if they wanted to compete on the world stage.
Yeah, because they'd seen what had happened to China right when China kind of resisted modernization.
Exactly. They didn't want to suffer the same fate.
Right, so massive societal upheaval, like all the traditional power structures are being dismantled, the economy's rapidly industrializing.
Yeah, it's a period of tremendous change, but also a lot of uncertainty and anxiety.
Right, because there's always pushback to change.
Of course.
So like all of this is happening and then bam, we get the Meiji Constitution.
Yeah, that's a key piece of the puzzle here.
Right, because this is one of the terms that you flagged for us.
Absolutely.
Um, and I guess my question would be like, okay, so you have a constitution. A constitution is supposed to like lay down the law.
Right, it's supposed to provide stability.
Yeah, so how does that contribute to militarism?
Well, the thing about the Meiji Constitution, which was adopted in 1889, is that it was full of ambiguities.
Oh,
So on the one hand, it established a parliamentary system, the Diet,
okay.
but it also granted significant power to the emperor.
Right, and we know that the emperor in Japan is considered like a divine figure.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky because the Constitution was kind of vague about the emperor's role in military affairs.
Ah, so this vagueness, this like lack of clarity.
Yeah, that's the loophole that the militarists could exploit.
Okay, so they could say, well, we're acting in the emperor's name.
Exactly. They could claim they were carrying out the emperor's will even if he wasn't directly involved.
So kind of hiding behind the emperor's authority.
In a way, yes. And it also created this situation where challenging the military was almost like challenging the emperor himself.
Right, because like who's going to question the emperor?
It was practically unthinkable for many people.
So they were using the emperor's divine authority as a shield.
Yeah, a very clever and, I guess you could say, sneaky tactic.
Absolutely. So we've got rapid modernization creating all this anxiety and uncertainty.
Right.
We've got a constitution that's kind of ripe for exploitation.
It's all the loopholes.
And speaking of the emperor,
Yeah.
you also mentioned Emperor Hirohito specifically.
Yeah, he's a really fascinating figure.
So like what was his role in all of this? Was he actually calling the shots or was he more of a figurehead?
You know, that's a question that historians are still debating to this day.
Ah, okay.
Hirohito's role is very complex and it's shrouded in some mystery.
Yeah.
Like, on the one hand, he was revered by the Japanese people as this godlike figure,
Right.
but the extent to which he was personally involved in shaping policy is difficult to determine.
So we don't know how much he was actually driving the bus versus just, being the face of it.
Exactly. Some argue he was actively involved in decision-making, while others believe he was more of a symbolic leader.
Kind of being used by the people around him.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay, so we've got rapid modernization.
Yeah.
We've got a constitution that's ripe for exploitation. We've got an emperor whose role is still debated.
It's a recipe for some pretty significant shifts in power.
Yeah, so what else is going on here that's helping these, so-called militarists gain traction?
Well, you highlighted two other really important terms in your list, nationalism and state Shintoism.
Right.
And these weren't just abstract ideas, they were very deliberately promoted by the government to shape public opinion.
Okay, so they were using these ideas as tools.
Exactly, to justify their actions and to build support for their agenda.
Right, so nationalism, I guess every country has some level of national pride.
Sure.
But like what made Japanese nationalism different?
Well, Japanese nationalism was very much tied to this belief in Japan's unique destiny.
Okay.
This idea that they were superior to other Asian nations and that they had this right, almost a divine right, to dominate the region.
So it's not just like we love our country, it's like we're destined to rule.
Yeah, it had this very expansionist element to it.
Okay.
And state Shintoism played a really crucial role here because it essentially blurred the lines between religion and politics.
Okay, how so?
Well, remember, the emperor was considered a divine descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu.
Right.
So through state Shintoism, they were basically presenting the emperor as this god king and framing war as a sacred duty to the nation.
Wow, so it's like your patriotic duty is also your religious duty.
Exactly. It's a very powerful combination.
Yeah, it's like questioning military is like questioning God.
Yeah, in a way, it made it very difficult to criticize the government's policies without seeming unpatriotic or even sacrilegious.
So they've created this environment where any kind of dissent is seen as like heresy.
Yeah, it was a very effective way to silence opposition.
Wow, okay, so we've got this kind of toxic brew of ideas and circumstances.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And I think we're going to have to leave it there for now.
That's good.
But we'll pick up this conversation in our next part and really start to dig into like how these ideas translated into concrete actions.
Looking forward to it.
All right, see you then.
See them.
Fuck it. Okay, so we're back and we're talking about the rise of militarism in Japan. And we've kind of laid out the groundwork now.
Yeah, we talked about modernization, the Meiji Constitution, Emperor Hirohito, the rise of nationalism and state Shintoism.
Right, it's like this whole recipe for disaster starting to come together.
Yeah, all these different ingredients are kind of mixing and bubbling.
So I guess my question now is like, okay, so you've got these ideas floating around. You've got these people who are pushing for a more aggressive foreign policy.
These so-called militarists?
Yeah, exactly. But like, how do those ideas translate into actual actions?
Well, it's important to remember that this wasn't just some fringe movement.
Yep.
These militarists had real power and influence.
All right, they were the government. They were in the military.
Exactly. And they were able to use their positions to shape policy and steer Japan in a more militaristic direction.
So they're not just like, you know, writing angry letters to the editor or something.
Well, they're the ones making the decisions.
Yeah, okay, so what do they do? Like, do they just start picking fights with other countries?
Well, one of their early targets was Manchuria,
Okay.
which is a region in northeastern China.
Right.
It was rich in resources like coal and iron, things that Japan needed for its growing industries.
Okay, so they've got their eye on Manchuria. Why?
Well, officially, they claim that they needed to protect Japanese interests in the region.
Okay.
But in reality, they were looking for an excuse to expand their territory and gain control of those resources.
So it's all about resources and expansion.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, in 1931, the Japanese military stages an incident. They blow up a section of railway and blame it on Chinese dissidents.
Wait, so they just like made up an excuse to invade?
Yeah, pretty much. That's crazy. It was a blatant act of aggression that was widely condemned by the international community.
I can imagine.
The League of Nations, which was the international organization created after World War I to prevent this kind of thing,
Right.
they condemned Japan's actions.
Okay, good. So at least someone's calling them out on this.
But unfortunately, the League of Nations didn't have any real power to enforce its decisions.
Oh, so they were basically toothless.
Yeah, pretty much they relied on the cooperation of member nations, and Japan just ignored their condemnation.
So they're like, yeah, whatever, we're doing this anyway.
Exactly. And they continued to occupy Manchuria.
So they get away with it.
Yeah, in a way they did, and it set a dangerous precedent for other aggressor nations.
Right, because if Japan can just ignore the League of Nations and get away with it, why can't other countries do the same thing?
Exactly. It showed the weakness of the international system, and it emboldened those who sought to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so this is a big turning point then, not just for Japan, but for the world.
Absolutely. It's a sign that things are really starting to unravel.
Okay, so back in Japan, what are the militarists doing now that they've kind of tasted victory?
Well, they're not just content with expanding their territory, they're also consolidating their power within Japan itself.
Okay, so they're tightening their grip.
Exactly. And one of the ways they do this is through the establishment of the Peace Preservation Department in 1925.
Okay, that's one of the terms you flagged for us.
Yeah, and it's a really chilling example of how they use the language of peace to mask their true intentions.
Right, because peace preservation sounds good on the surface.
Exactly. But in reality, this department was tasked with suppressing any kind of political opposition.
So they're basically silencing anyone who disagrees with them.
Yeah, anyone who criticizes the military or the government's policies.
Wow, and how do they do that?
Well, they use a variety of tactics: intimidation, censorship, imprisonment.
So they're creating a climate of fear.
Yeah, basically people are afraid to speak out against the government.
Okay, so it's starting to sound a lot like a dictatorship at this point.
Yeah, the lines are definitely getting blurred.
Okay, so they've got control of the military. They're silencing their opponents.
Right.
What's next?
Well, they also have a plan for the future of Japan, and it's laid out in a document called an outline plan for the reorganization of Japan.
Okay, another one of our terms.
Yes. This document was drafted in 1932,
Hmm.
and it basically called for the creation of a totalitarian state under military control.
Wow, so they're not messing around.
No, they have a very clear vision for what they want Japan to become.
And what is that vision?
Well, they want Japan to be economically self-sufficient. They want to expand their territory, and they want to establish Japanese dominance in Asia.
So basically they want to create like a Japanese empire.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's okay, so this is their master plan.
Yeah, you could say that.
But how do they plan to actually achieve all of this?
Well, they believe that war is the answer.
Okay, so they're not just talking about this theoretically.
No, they're actively preparing for war.
So they're building up their military, they're stockpiling weapons.
Mhm. Exactly, and they're also working to indoctrinate the population with their ideology.
Right, so they're using propaganda to convince people that war is necessary.
Yeah, they're appealing to people's sense of patriotism and their religious beliefs.
So it's like a whole mind game.
Yeah, it's very sophisticated and very dangerous.
Okay, so they've got the ideology, they've got the power, they've got the plan.
Right.
What's the final trigger? What pushes them over the edge?
Well, that's a whole other story.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to save that for part 3.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're back, and things are getting pretty intense over in Japan.
Yeah, the militarists are really in the driver's seat at this point.
They've got the ideology, they've got control of the government and the military. They've even got a blueprint for a whole new Japan.
Right, they're calling it the Showa Restoration, this idea of creating a new era of Japanese glory.
But like we were talking about before, it's not just about Japan itself, right? They've got these ambitions for expansion and dominance in Asia.
Exactly, they see themselves as the rightful leaders of the region.
But the problem is, there are other countries with interests in Asia.
Right, the United States in particular.
Yeah, the U.S. has been expanding its influence in the Pacific for decades.
They've got territories in the Philippines and Guam.
Right, and they're also a major trading partner with China.
So there's definitely some potential for conflict there.
Yeah, it's like two trains heading toward each other on the same track.
Exactly. And as Japan becomes more aggressive, their actions start to clash with American interests.
So what happens? Do they try to negotiate?
Well, there are some attempts at diplomacy, but the militarists are really calling the shots in Japan.
And they're not exactly known for their compromising spirit.
No, they see any attempt to limit their expansion as a threat to Japan's destiny.
So things escalate.
Yeah, tensions rise and the U.S. starts to put economic pressure on Japan.
Like sanctions and stuff?
Exactly. They cut off vital supplies like oil.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Japan's economy is heavily reliant on imported oil.
Right. It's a gamble, though.
How so?
Well, the U.S. is hoping that these sanctions will force Japan to back down.
Make them rethink their aggressive policies.
Yeah, but it could also backfire.
Right. It could push Japan into a corner and make them feel like they have nothing to lose.
Exactly. And that's kind of what happened here.
So they lash out.
Yeah. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor,
Oh, wow.
the U.S. naval base in Hawaii.
A date which will live in infamy, as they say.
Yeah, it's a devastating attack that cripples the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
And brings the United States into World War II.
Yeah, it's a turning point in history.
So Japan's gamble backfires in a big way.
Absolutely. Instead of achieving their goals, they end up facing the full might of the United States.
And we all know how that ends.
Yeah, Japan is ultimately defeated in 1945 after years of brutal warfare.
It's a tragic end to a story that really started decades earlier.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how easily things can spiral out of control.
And how dangerous it is when a small group of people with extreme ideologies gain too much power.
Exactly. It's a lesson that we should never forget.
Well said. Well, this has been a really fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And I think it's really given us a lot to think about in terms of how we understand the past and how we approach the challenges of the present.
Absolutely. History is full of valuable lessons if we're willing to listen.
All right, well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the rise of militarism. in Japan.
Mm.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.